Hello, my name is David Worsfold, Group Editorial Services Director at Incisive Media, and I have with me Jonathan Evans MP, the newly elected Chairman of the All Party Parliamentary Group on Insurance and Financial Services. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, David.
Interesting time to take over a role like that. A lot on the agenda. What are going to be the priorities for the group in this Parliament?
Well, I think you're right. First of all, we've just arrived in Parliament. We found that the whole of the regulatory architecture affecting insurance and financial services is changing, and changing in a very radical way. Probably, first major change for 13 years. The system we know completely moved aside. And I think we need to understand the way in which this new system operates and impacts with the industry. For instance, if you look at what's going to happen in relation to insurance companies, it's pretty clear that the prudential regulation role is going to be one that's very much under the Bank of England. But if you look at the way in which IFAs in the past have been regulated by the FSA, it seems that that's going to be more within the consumer protection aspect of the new structure, the new architecture that's being set up. And I think that IFAs and insurance companies will want to understand that. We as parliamentarians, I think, will want to understand exactly what the government are proposing, and also the way in which the regulators see this operating in practice.
Because, as you said, this is going to replace the tripartite system that a lot of people say failed because certain issues fell between the different elements of the tripartite system. Isn't there a danger with the new system that actually the gaps are just in a different place and that things might still fall between them?
Well, I think that in a way, whenever you're readjusting arrangements, there's this danger about whether you're closing the stable door after the horse has bolted and whether, in fact, there'll be another door that the horse bolts through in due course. That's always a danger. We always have to look out for this. But I think that if you look at the major difficulty that there was over the financial crisis we've just been through, it was the real failure to understand the overall systemic risk that there was within the banking sector, and a failure to understand the dynamic, if you like, in terms of the whole of the banking sector solvency question and issues in relation to who really took responsibility for that. So I'm a supporter of the idea of having very clear demarcation lines here, putting that question very clearly under the control of the Bank of England. I think we understand that. Also, the prudential regulation role coming under the Bank of England, we understand that as well. I think what we understand a little bit less are the dynamics of the way in which the consumer protection aspects are going to work, the accountability and governance aspects that flow from this. After all, IFAs will well know that they're challenged on those issues all of the time. I think it's legitimate for us to ask, under this new architecture, how is it that the regulator has appropriate governance so that we can see that governance operating in practice?
Because one of the issues there, particularly from the intermediaries' point of view, general insurance brokers, IFAs, it's the FSA they felt was overbearing, was too obsessed with rules and the minutiae of the operation of their businesses. And many intermediaries have sort of gone, whoopee, no more FSA. How are we going to stop, how's a group like yours going to stop a new organisation called a Consumer Protection and Markets Agency, but Consumer Protection Agency, being overbearing on the intermediary sector? Because that's what they'll be looking for, isn't it?
Well, I think the first message that I want to give to the IFAs is that we as a group view our primary responsibility, of course, to the consumer. They're our constituents. In fact, in the challenge that we've seen so often between the FSA and insurance companies or IFAs, the argument put forward by the industry has been, of course, we're interested in the consumer interest. But we, as parliamentarians, that's our primary focus. Why? Because the consumer is our constituent. But at the same time, IFAs are our constituents as well. So I have to say, sadly, to the IFAs who say, this is the end of regulation, we're completely free, all the bonds have gone. It's not going to be a world like that. It is important that we should be maintaining high standards. The arrangements that are being put in place in relation to certification of competence of approved persons, that is clearly something that still has to be seen in practice, and I think IFAs wouldn't disagree with that. I think that the concern that I have found from those within my own constituency who've expressed their worries to me have been about the point that you've made, that in a sense the FSA tend to take the close and continuous approach that they so often take with so many of the financial big financial giants that they deal with, and they're taking that approach really right down to the coalface with people who aren't going to have a systemic impact upon the wider financial markets.
And looking at this change architecture and the process we're going to have to go through to put it in place, it's going to take some debate, it's going to take some time, we're talking 2012. In the meantime, beyond these shores, in Europe and elsewhere, there is a lot of debate and a lot of action to put in place new structures, regulatory structures, and new rules regarding the financial services sector. Is there not a danger that the UK might lose out in those debates because it's disengaged, because it's almost looking at its own navel?
I think two responses there. First of all, in relation to the changes themselves, I view it as a positive that Hector Sanz has decided to remain in post in order to drive through the process of putting into place the new arrangements. So as you rightly say, we have to see the legislation going through, yes, but at the same time a level of continuity is important, and so therefore I don't want to get into the business of saying, oh, Hector Sanz was all to blame for all of this, we want him out through the door. That's a nonsense. I think that it's a very positive step that he remains a part of this. Having said that, you're also right to illustrate the fact that there are a whole range of dialogues taking place in Europe, and it's important that we're engaged in those dialogues. It's also important, I think, to maintain continuity. Many people who've been at the Bank of England or have been at the FSA are people who are well versed in those particular discussions. I would have thought that they are very likely to be the people who are still looking after the British interest against a background in which there's much, much more European activity, much more of a likelihood that we're going to see European regulations impacting upon us in the UK, even if it's the new regulatory architecture that is used in order to enforce those rules. So it is very important, I think, from the beginning that we maintain continuity of individuals if we're not maintaining continuity of structures.
And what do you say to people in the UK market, again, particularly looking at intermediaries, to general insurance brokers, the IFAs, who find it very difficult to get engaged with that debate? I mean, we've got the Insurance Mediation Directive being reviewed in Europe, and yet IFAs, general insurance brokers in this country, feel very, very separated from that debate. How can they influence that debate? How can they engage with it? Because it affects their livelihood, what's decided in Europe on these issues, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I must say that I was in the European Parliament at the time that the European Mediation Directive went through, and I can tell you that some parts of that directive were adjusted, were amended as a result of the intervention of French members. And then a lot of IFAs who will tell you that, of course, we've seen in the UK that directive put into force by the FSA, and yet in France, no effort to enforce it whatsoever. That's completely unacceptable. Having a review of the directive, I think, is worthwhile, but I think that what we would have preferred is to see if it was being enforced in Britain, it should be enforced in every other EU country, and there should be penalties imposed upon those countries who are bound by these directives, who allow their parliamentarians to contribute to what the structure of the directive may be, and then subsequently have this determination to completely ignore its enforcement. So I think that it is important that we don't end up in the same situation that intermediaries have been in for the last, 6 years or more, in which they're endeavouring to struggle with implementation of a directive that their competitors on the continent are just blithely ignoring.
And that's a message you've and your group's got to get through to government, presumably, so that they can go and make that case in Europe.
I think it's a message that we need to get through to government. It's a message we must get through to our counterparts, of course, in the European Parliament. It's a message that we want to get through to the European Commission, who, of course, are the sort of initiating body in relation to European legislation, and who are also, of course, the enforcement body. So I think that we have got a number of audiences for the message that I've just outlined.
Finally, just tell us how the group is coming together in the new Parliament. This is a Parliament with more new members than at any time since the Second World War, so it must be a challenge putting a group, a special interest group, back together. How's it going?
Well, I think the first point to be made is that I've taken over from a long-standing chairman of our group, John Greenway, very, very well known